Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Hey, welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. In a previous podcast just a few days ago, we talked about Pierre Poilievre and his return to Parliament. And the question we asked, somewhat rhetorically, I suppose, was Poilievre's return a blessing or a curse? And I mentioned at the time that there's really two levels to that. It's a question that the Conservatives themselves have to answer, and Canadians will have to answer. Well, Conservatives will tell us exactly how they feel in January when they have their leadership review. And by all indications, it looks as if he's probably going to pass that too. I don't know what, the extent of how popular he's going to be. But Conservatives have to rally behind their leader. And as a few pundits have said, there's really nobody else in the wings anyway. And as Corey Tenake, who's a very valued advisor, of course, he worked under the Harper campaign and worked for Doug Ford here in Ontario for a couple of elections. Leaders are usually changed when there's somebody below that's trying to push them out of office. And I don't see that happening with the Conservative Party. But more importantly, when I said, is Poilievre a curse or a blessing, Canadians have already responded to that. And to put some context to this, Angus Reid has come out, one of the most respected pollsters here in this country, with some interesting numbers about the Conservatives during the last election and the Conservatives with Pierre Poilievre, I guess in anticipation of the fact that he was going to win the by-election, which of course he did. And I think, I know I've mentioned for many, many years on my radio show and subsequent podcasts, I don't really have a lot of faith sometimes in pollsters because, well, they can't always give you exactly what's going on. But that's really based on polls during election time, because I know that people try to manipulate those polls. I've talked to people on my show for years now that said they specifically give wrong answers to pollsters during election times just to try to skew the numbers. But this is non-election, and this is really, okay, how do you feel about that party? How do you feel about their policy? How do you feel about the leader? And I think without that bias or that inclination to try to mess things up, you can get some pretty interesting information. I think it's very instructive as to where Canadians are with the Conservative Party, and certainly with Poilievre as the leader of the party. And we'll juxtapose this with what we talked about a week or so ago, polling that was done about the Liberals and Mark Carney. And there are some people, of course, right across the country that have expressed some concern that the trade deals are not going the way we wanted, and maybe we wanted a better resolution by this time, and it hasn't been forthcoming. They're not necessarily critical of the government, but they're a little anxious about this, and I can understand that. We all are. Nonetheless, Carney's personal ratings and personal popularity ratings still continue to be high. I think they're down 1 percentage point or something like that. He's about 64 instead of 65, which is still pretty comfortable. Poilievre, on the other hand, is a different story. Let's delve into a few of those numbers to give us some sort of an idea as to what's going on. Not that we're anticipating an election anytime soon, but he's going to be back there in the opposition benches in September the 15th, I guess it is, when they go back to Parliament. And we've asked, is it going to be the same old Poilievre, or is there going to be a changed guy? And I, quite frankly, as I've said on the podcast, I don't think he can change. He is what he is. And I think Canadians have spoken about that. So let's look at some of the numbers about just how they feel about this. And it's interesting, just to put some context, Angus Reid broke this down into, Conservative supporters, Liberal supporters, NDP supporters, Bloc supporters. But there's another column here that I found fascinating. And it's called, they considered voting for the Conservatives, but ended up voting for another party, which begs the question, well, why? You were looking that way and you were leaning that way, but you didn't vote it. And there's a couple of questions here I think that really stand out. One of the questions that they asked here during the survey was that the Conservative Party did not articulate a clear plan for the country. 70% of the people that ended up not voting Conservative but were considering it said that, they didn't get a clear plan. They didn't understand exactly what they were doing. Pierre Poilievre sounded too much like Donald Trump. 60% of those people felt that was the case. I think that number is probably a little bit larger, really. And the campaign slogan, "Bring it home," didn't make any sense. Well, again, almost 58% of the people that considered Conservative and ended up not voting for the Conservatives think that was kind of a silly slogan. And we've talked about that, that Poilievre's campaign seemed to be based on slogans and catchphrases and bullet points. And I think Canadians were looking for a little more substance, and they were certainly getting that from the Liberals and from Carney, but not from Poilievre himself. But it goes down to the idea about the leader and the popularity of the leader. And I'm not suggesting for a second that you have to have the most popular leader to win an election. Stephen Harper was not a warm, fuzzy guy. I've heard all sorts of stories about, you should see him behind closed doors. Well, that's immaterial. Canadians in general just didn't really warm up to the guy, but he did win elections. He won a minority government, a majority government, and another minority government. Now, you could argue that was because there's virtually no opposition from the Liberals at that time, but nonetheless, it's not necessarily the factor, but it can be a contributing factor. Popularity and likability do matter with elected officials. Canadians seem to like Mark Carney. They seem to feel comfortable with him. Not so much with Pierre Poilievre. And that's reflected, I think, in this Angus Reid survey that talks about, two key statements here that the Conservatives, I think, have to understand and have to take into consideration. The proportion of Canadians who believe that Poilievre is not sincere has risen 7 points in the last 2 years. In other words, he's been the leader for almost 3 years. We have got to know this guy. This is not as if he's an unknown entity. We're learning more about Pierre Poilievre, and the reflection here seems to be that the more we know of him, the less we like him. The likability factor is actually decreasing as time goes on. Half of the people that were surveyed, 50%, say they would be ashamed to have Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister. Think about that. Think about that you're going to elect somebody or keep somebody as your party leader, where half the Canadians would be ashamed if that individual was the Prime Minister of this country. And as we've talked about on the podcast, they are choppy waters, rough waters that we're dealing with the Trump administration and with tariffs and trying to articulate some common sense out of Washington, which is becoming harder and harder every day. And I hear from so many of you through the podcast and for your comments on the podcasts that are simply saying, well, thank God it's Carney that's doing this, and thank God Poilievre isn't the guy that's trying to carry the weight for Canada right now. And that's reflected in this Angus Reid survey. And I think it's a very telling statistic to understand that people just don't seem to have the confidence in this guy. And that one of the old bugaboos that's been going on with the Conservative Party for years and years is once again reflected in this Angus Reid survey. The majority of women just don't believe that the Conservative Party, and Pierre Poilievre specifically, are genuinely interested about women's issues. And again, that goes back to what we talked about a couple of minutes ago, that the majority of Canadians just feel that Poilievre is insincere. And I know that, it's going to be easy for people that are dyed-in-the-wool Conservative supporters to say, dismiss that. They just hate the Conservatives. Poilievre came on board and really made his oats and I guess made a name for himself for such as it is, basically picking on Justin Trudeau. And in hindsight, as we've talked about here on the podcast, that was a pretty easy target. In other words, Poilievre was taking shots at Trudeau, and many Canadians were gathering behind him because they didn't like him. I mean, this was one of the most unpopular prime ministers in a long, long time. They didn't like his policies. They didn't like his attitude. And anybody who was going to take this guy on and try to take shots at him was certainly going to gain some public support. Well, they don't feel that same way about Mark Carney. Yet Poilievre doesn't seem to be able to pivot, and that's a key element. We talked about that, remember, during the election campaign, that you must be able to pivot. Case in point, one of the strong points of Poilievre's attack on the Liberals over the years has been the carbon tax. And we're going to eliminate the carbon tax. It's wrong, yada, yada, yada. Well, first thing Mark Carney did after he became prime minister was he eliminated the carbon tax. Poilievre didn't pivot. He still complained and still attacked the Liberals for it. It kind of reminds me of like Donald Trump and some of the radical and illogical things that he said. He's blaming Joe Biden for things that are going on, things that he created and did. He can't look at himself and say, okay, we need to change your pivot. So you blame the other guy, apportioning blame someplace else. And Poilievre seems to be of that ilk. And that kind of is reflected in that stat we talked about a few minutes ago, where almost half of Canadians said that he is too Trump-like, not necessarily in his policies, but in his attitude, his disdain for media, his disdain for women's issues, some concerned very much about social issues, and he doesn't seem to have any empathy for the people in those particular areas too. It's all part of a bigger package here. And the reason we're looking at this now, the reason Angus Reid talked about this now, is because he will be the opposition leader. And you always have to ask yourself, is he going to be in opposition? Is he going to oppose just on principle to oppose because he's the other party? Or is he going to be looking at what's happening and asking during this, it's still minority government, are there things that we can cooperate on and partner with? And I don't know if he's got the head to do that. I just don't know that it's in him to be able to do that. The case in point was that Bill C-5, which was the infrastructure enhancement bill that Prime Minister Carney had talked about, and just before they took their summer break, that actually passed. The Conservative Party supported that in the House. Now, Andrew Scheer was the House leader then, obviously, because Poilievre didn't have a seat. And there's a classic scene, and we talked about this, of when the vote finally happened and the Conservatives supported it and that bill passed. Carney walked across the aisle and shook hands with Andrew Scheer. That doesn't mean they're going to be BFFs forever and ever, but it was almost like, thank you for supporting such an important piece of legislation. And that is what we call bipartisan support. I don't think that's a phrase that Pierre Poilievre understands, and I don't think it's a phrase that Pierre Poilievre can embrace. And that's one of the things I think that we as Canadians should be concerned about, is that we have to look at what's going on here and saying, look, we're in a sticky situation here. We need everybody rowing together. Former Harper Cabinet Minister James Moore, I was talking to CTV News about this a couple of days ago, and said it's better when everybody's opposed to the current government. The Harper had his enemies. He had Dalton McGuinty and others at the provincial level, but they were able to get stuff through nonetheless. And Chrétien had the Bloc and others going on in Quebec. I get that. And yeah, okay, that you're always going to run into political roadblocks. But in a time of distress like this, isn't it better if we're all at least rowing in the same direction? Moore seemed to intimate that if everybody's on side and supporting what Carney's doing, that could be a bad thing. There is dissension within that support. We've heard that from the premiers. We've heard that from other people in government. We're not crazy about this. Doug Ford's been quite open about that. He'd like to see Carney be more aggressive, counter tariffs and things of this nature. Scott Moe and Danielle Smith, of course, are pretty vocal about their ideas too. But within that dissent, there is still a common goal, a Canada First thing. Canada first over partisan politics. And I don't get the impression from most of the Conservatives that are speaking out about this, and certainly from Pierre Poilievre, that they are either not capable or simply don't want to be that person. They don't seem to want to get rid of partisan politics at the behest of what is best for the country. And that's not the kind of system, and that's not the kind of attitude we need in these very, very troubling times. We've talked constantly. We go on and on and on about critical discussions in critical times. These are critical times. And we want people in Parliament that are going to understand that they have to work together, not to oppose everything just on principle or on political philosophy, but work together on key issues to try to get us through this crap. The Canadians in general feel the same way about him. And it's not I know that every time we do a survey like this, yes, it's a photograph in time, but at the same time, when you put it in the context of this is compared to the past 3 years that Poilievre has been the leader, those disapproval numbers or the disapproved feeling that Canadians are feeling are still on the increase after 3 years. And that should tell the Conservatives a story. It's time for a little introspection, I think, as they head towards their first session with Poilievre as the opposition leader from Alberta now, as opposed to the Carleton riding. Are they going to be playing a part in this? Or are they simply going to stew in the opposition seat and oppose everything just on principle? That's not the way we should be running this country right now. Canadians are telling them that. The question is, are they listening? That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. You can catch us, of course, wherever you get your podcasts, and we really do appreciate that. If you're on YouTube watching, don't forget, hit the notification bell. You can catch the podcast description, of course. We'll put some other articles in there and give you some context on some of these discussions. And please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We've talked about this over the last little while, and your loyalty to the podcast is great. We just really do appreciate that. But by subscribing, well, you'll be able to help the podcast to carry through and to continue the work that we're doing here, too, and we really do appreciate that. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.